Hi folks, my name is Phil and welcome to Grounded, the series which looks at airlines of yesteryear. This episode will take a look at the very short-lived Pride Air. In the early 1980s, the aviation industry in the United States was in some disarray. Deregulation had finally happened, allowing new airlines to sprout up overnight and challenge the already established carriers. Those larger airlines now found themselves in a predicament. They all had high labour costs, which were funded by their high fares. These new upstart airlines arriving on the scene had lower operating costs and were able to undercut the larger competition. Continental Airlines was one such airline in trouble. They had previously attempted to merge with Western Airlines, but had found themselves a victim of a hostile takeover from Frank Lorenzo's Texas Air Corporation. Continental's management and employees valiantly tried to block the takeover with an employee stock ownership plan. However, they lost a protracted legal battle and Continental fell into Lorenzo's hands. With that, the merger with Western was aborted and Continental's future looked bleak. Lorenzo insisted that Continental was stuck in a pre-deregulation mentality and needed to change drastically in order to survive. Texas International was merged into Continental in 1982, but bigger changes were afoot. Lorenzo was very anti-union and he was unhappy with the concessions offered by the Continental workforce and forced put the company into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. This allowed him to amend or void contracts as he saw fit. The result of this was numerous strikes across the board, from engineers and mechanics to the pilots and flight attendants. The strikes crippled Continental. At one point the airline was grounded for 3 days, but eventually operations resumed, in part due to newly hired non-union employees and some other strike-breaking staff. A number of returning staff were in for a nasty shock, however. Nearly 140 junior pilots were told that if they returned, they would be at the bottom of the seniority list, below the newly hired non-union strikebreakers. For some, this was too much and they decided to do something about it. Paul Eckel was a former chief pilot at Continental. After resigning from the airline, he founded Pride Air. Barry Duggan was the former head of marketing at Continental and took the position of company president, with Eckel taking on the role of chairman and CEO. Pride Air was unique as it was mostly funded by its employees, most of whom were coming over from Continental. The larger the investment, the higher on the seniority list one would find themselves. A lot of pilots invested their retirement savings into the new venture. In total, around $15.5 million was raised by the employees, with a further $4.3 million invested by venture capitalists. Pride Air selected New Orleans for their base of operations. It was fairly centrally located, allowing the airline to serve destinations on both the east and west coasts. It's of course helped that there was little competition, which was always important for any new airline. The airline had initially selected Kansas City as its base of operations. It was an ideal centrally located airport. However, the much larger Eastern Airlines began to focus on Kansas City, so New Orleans was chosen instead. Pride Air leased a small fleet of Boeing 727 trijets, which were quickly painted up in the airline's distinctive colour scheme. The airline's main colour was blue, however on the aircraft this was supplemented with grey, light blue and purple cheat lines, and their placement does mimic that of the Continental livery, though that may just be a coincidence. The airline's logo was a circle intersected by 3 horizontal lines which shift in the centre, a reflection of their route structure connecting through New Orleans in the middle. The airline began taking reservations on July the 8th, with the first flight scheduled for a few weeks later on August the 1st, 1985. In the run-up to those first flights, Pride Air had gone on a marketing offensive, with advertisements in print, radio and television. The company had adopted the slogan, "You can feel it in the air." Flights began as scheduled on Thursday the 1st of August 1985, with the airline serving 15 destinations from its New Orleans hub. Those destinations included Denver, Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego, Las Vegas, Salt Lake City, Jacksonville, Miami, Orlando, Tampa and West Palm Beach. Pride Air prided itself on offering a full service to rival that of any other scheduled carrier, and while it seemed to get off to a good start, the airline was losing money from day one. In October 1985, the airline was launching an initial public offering, which was expected to bring in around $10 million of investment. However, the company was forced to cancel this IPO due to insufficient interest. It was in early November when Pride Air's 44 daily flights finally operated at break-even for the first time, but unfortunately for them, the situation was looking dire. The airline was in the process of securing a $50 million rescue package which would allow the airline to continue operating. The company president, Barry Duggan, resigned, and to top it off, Continental started to muscle in. The irony of Continental putting the squeeze on Pride Air was not lost on anyone, and it certainly made the small carrier a less than appealing prospect for investment. Pride Air reportedly had debts of $7.6 million with a further $2.5 million in outstanding bills. The airline's bank, the First National Bank of Commerce, froze the Pride Air account and the $200,000 that remained. With increasing debts and its bank account frozen, Pride Air had no option but to cease operations on November the 15th, with all 566 employees being made redundant. It will be a further 2 weeks before the airline filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy proceedings, which will give the airline a slim chance of survival. It was hoped that Pride Air would be back in the air by Christmas, serving a smaller number of destinations using 2 Boeing 727s that it would lease from Evergreen International. Pride chairman Paul Eccles stated that he was in the process of establishing a $15 million line of credit with a foreign bank, and that it would cost $1 million to get Pride Air in the skies again. The Christmas relaunch never happened, but again there was a glimmer of hope when in February 1986 a federal bankruptcy judge approved a $30 million rescue package. This was going to come from an unnamed foreign investor. It would have seen Pride Air operate a smaller fleet of 727s and serve Miami, Orlando, Las Vegas and Los Angeles from New Orleans. Unfortunately, this again come to nothing and Pride Air was grounded permanently. So, what went wrong? The collapse of Pride Air was down to a number of factors. As with any new airline, it had to face startup costs, and it would have to endure these for a while before it could bring in revenue. The airline had secured around $19.8 million of investment, roughly $48 million in today's money. This should have been enough to sustain Pride Air for several months. Unfortunately, the airline seemed to burn through cash at an alarming rate, and it was a situation made worse with the majority of their flights operating at a loss. It took 3 months of flying before the flights even began to break even. The Boeing 727 trijet was more expensive to operate than, say, a 737, however it was more readily available. A number of the Pride Air fleet had come from the recently bankrupted Braniff, and they would have been picked up on favourable terms. The 737 was still hugely in demand, and the lease rates would have reflected that. Don't forget that the pilots were all ex-Continental, and no doubt flew 727s over there, so there was another reason for that choice in aircraft. The other factor in the company's demise was Continental going on the attack. They already served New Orleans following their merger with Texas International, but had now taken a low-fare and high-frequency approach which poached passengers away from Pride. If Continental forcing Pride Air out of business was intentional on the part of Frank Lorenzo, it's open to debate. I don't think it was, but I certainly wouldn't have put it past him. What made the demise of Pride Air that bit harder to swallow was that it wasn't corporate investors and moguls who lost the money, it was their employees, the folks who had been beaten down at Continental and tried to make a go of it themselves and invested whatever they could, be it a few $1,000s or their retirement plans, and of course, it was all lost. Pride Air wasn't the only airline to be launched by former airline pilots. A few years after Pride, Kiwi International was founded by a number of ex-Eastern Airlines pilots who had been made redundant following that airline's demise. Rather ironically, Eastern was pillaged and destroyed by Frank Lorenzo. Kiwi operated for nearly 7 years and their story will be told shortly, so check back soon for that one, or better yet, subscribe to catch it as it drops. And as always, thanks for watching.